Hey everyone, and welcome to Boston Autoblog. 2021 has been a year of growth, but also a year of reflection as well. One in which I've been taking a lot of time for myself and thinking about where I want to go with this channel and also where I want to go in my own personal life. And so far when it comes to the channel, I think we're moving in the right direction for sure. I've been thinking about my childhood, my middle school and high school days, and I find it rather fitting that the pinnacle of my nostalgia, I am going to be featuring and showcasing my first ever dream car. That is right, the 2000 Pontiac Trans Am WS6. And you're probably wondering and saying, hold on a minute, how old are you? Because most millennials are not going to be looking at a 20-year-old car, nor are they going to be dreaming about one. I am 28 years old, so when this car came off the assembly line, I was 7. And this car has a lot of sentimental value to me, but also it's a car that symbolizes an end of an era for American manufacturers, as this is really one of the last old school muscle cars. Now, when we look at where Detroit muscle is today, you have the Challenger and Charger Hellcats, you have the Camaro and the Ford Mustang, and everything is about performance numbers, not only when it comes to 0 to 60 times, but also the horsepower that you have under the hood. And it just seems as though that the brands are now trying to one-up each other, and we've kind of lost that old school feel. We're losing the mechanical side of things and what makes driving so fun and engaging. Because the driving experience is supposed to be enjoyable for every single minute, not every fraction of a second. If you have a Hellcat and you accelerate off the line, you can only enjoy that for 3 seconds. And if you are feeling a bit more adventurous, you can really push it, but then you might get a speeding ticket. Whereas the Pontiac Trans Am is certainly not the fastest car out there. In fact, you have horsepower numbers below 350 horsepower, which that's just mind-boggling to me right now when you look at where muscle cars are today. But also when it comes to 0 to 60 times, a lot of cars with turbocharged 4-cylinder engines are going to have no problem gapping this car off the line and even during a roll. And that's why I am here, because we don't really check out a lot of mechanical cars. We don't really check out a lot of old school cars. And this is really an opportunity for me to get a good idea of what this car was all about back in 2000. And also see why a lot of car enthusiasts are starting to understand what this car means and why the values when it comes to the used car prices have appreciated for the WS6. But also we're going to see why it's still a special car in the automotive world. Now, before we get in this video, I want to give a very special thank you and shout out to Adam, who is the general manager of Infiniti of Norwood, but also the owner of this Pontiac Trans Am. And it really means a lot to me that he trusted me enough to take the keys to his own car and experience it for the entire day. Also, of course, with this car being one that really is close and dear to my own heart and soul when it comes to being a car enthusiast, this means a whole heck of a lot, and I just cannot thank him enough for this opportunity. And so, after over 2 decades of waiting, let's start her up and let's get right into this review. "20 long years of waiting, actually probably 21 years for this particular model, and I'm finally experiencing a Pontiac Trans Am WS6. Now, when this car came out, I was getting into 2nd grade. I was around 7 years old. While my classmates and friends are talking about Pokemon cards, pretending that they're football players, or of course, talking about Jurassic Park, I'm there on the playground, sitting next to the flagpole. I can still remember this like it was yesterday, dreaming of owning this particular car, the Pontiac Trans Am. Now, there was a whole list of cars that I wanted back in 2000, 2001, but this was one of the staple cars. This was one of the cars that I wanted to own so bad. And you think about it, 2000, you're probably looking at a Ferrari 355, Porsche 911, 996, even the 993s. Ferrari F40, Lamborghini, Diablo, all these cars that you can list. And you're probably wondering, a Pontiac Trans Am, that's what you wanted? Yes, absolutely. This car to me is very special. I have no idea why and why I was drawn into it at such a young age. I think it's the looks, but also I grew up in an American muscle car household where my dad had a Pontiac Trans Am in high school. I think he owned it in 1975. Also, my uncle had a Plymouth Duster and a Plymouth Cuda. So it was only right for me to get into the American muscle way of life. But also, little did I know that within 20 years, that this car would become very special. Because car enthusiasts have finally understood what this car is all about. We're gonna have a nice opportunity to at least give it some gas here. This car can go from 0 to 60 in around 5 seconds. And I mean, I've driven faster cars, but there's something about the Pontiac Trans Am that I just can't shake. And I don't know if it's the V8. I don't know if it's the Borla exhaust. I don't even know if it's the nostalgia talking. But there's something deep in my soul that I have a feeling while driving this car. I have driven a couple Ferraris, I've driven a couple Aston Martins and some Porsches, but never once have I been so enamored and so in love with the driving experience that I'm experiencing right now on this test drive. But I think it's also the fact that this car is all mechanical. Now, there is some technological aspects that will aid your performance and your driving dynamics. Of course, you do have traction control, but the steering is so tight in this car. Also, the braking, it's not very responsive like my Volkswagen GTI. But also, there's no digital gauge cluster. There's no touchscreen. You have physical dials. This is so old school, but I love it. But also the T-tops. Gotta love the T-tops. Now, I have no idea how that's affecting the sound and the audio for this test drive, but that's what's adding to the specialness of this car and what made it look very good. Now, you could do the same with the Camaro, and yeah, the Camaro looks good. I wanted a Camaro too. I wanted a black Camaro Z28, and I also wanted a red Pontiac Trans Am of the same generation. But to me, this car looks a heck of a lot better. Now, when it comes to the front vision of this car, I was expecting something a little worse because you do sit a little low to the ground, of course, with this being an American muscle car of the late 90s, early 2000s. But I was expecting the hood to be a bit more extended where I couldn't see everything in front of me. I was also expecting a little bit more of a wider front end. And actually, I have a good amount of front vision to work with. A-pillars are not very aggressive at all, but I gotta be honest, vision everywhere else is pretty poor. I can't really see a lot behind me other than the rear view mirror, but also when it comes to the blind spots, the side mirrors are basically useless. They're so small that you have to look over your shoulder to see what's behind you. But the V8 in this car, when you get on it, it lifts up. Now, of course, a lot of enthusiasts are going to want to go with the 6-speed manual. We have the 4-speed automatic today, but that is not bothering me at all. Now, also, of course, with this model being a 2000, it's not going to have the same sense of being highly coveted just because the 01 and 02s had a bit more when it came to mechanical aspects, when it comes to the parts that were used, because you do have a bit more Corvette pieces for 01 and 02. You're going to have a different camshaft, but also you're going to have an LS6 air intake from the Z06 C5. So this car is a bit different once you start getting into the higher model years, the 02s, the 01s. But the 2000s are going to be left behind and forgotten about because they're not those specific model years. But I gotta be honest, it's still pretty special. Now, getting into the changes for the Pontiac Trans Am and why throughout the years it got better and why enthusiasts and car collectors have slowly really gravitated toward this car over the C5 is because in 1996, the WS6 package made its way back onto this car. And you could get that with other generations, but not for the 94 and 95. Then in around 97, 98, you had the different front fascia. You had the more aggressive nostril grills. You also had a more aggressive front fascia, and the car became a true muscle car. But then also you would have the LS1 motor making its way in 1998, and that is the same engine that came from the Chevrolet Corvette. So now you have a baby C5 Corvette that was also more attainable as well at the time. Also you had larger front and rear sway bars to make this car corner a lot better. But this car changed over time to make it what it is today, and why 20 years later so many people, including myself, wants to own one. Now when it comes to the driving dynamics though, of course you have enough power to get around slower drivers, but the steering input, you have to actually put some muscle into it. You have to really dig deep and get this car to corner, and I like it. It actually adds so much feedback, and out of all the cars I've driven, the newer sports cars, even some of the exotics, that takes so much away. This is a completely different experience. But also the throttle and the braking, you have to really put your foot down. You have, when it comes to the braking, it doesn't brake like a Volkswagen GTI. I think when it comes to the performance of my GTI, when it comes to off-the-line performance, and even when it comes to braking, it's a better performing car in that aspect, but there's not as much soul, there's not as much passion when you are driving this car around. This is so special to me. But also when it comes to the suspension, I'm not getting thrown around. Yes, I'm feeling the imperfections, but I'm not cringing when I go over the bumps. Like that. I don't really feel the creaking and the rattling. This car actually has a sense of refinement and quality that I was not expecting, with this being my first time experiencing a Pontiac Trans Am and an F-body car. This is exceeding my expectations in more ways than one. I really thought that this car was going to be showing its age, that it was going to be a car that was nowhere close to being enjoyable to drive like the cars that I've driven throughout the last few years. The Pontiac Trans Am, some people will say, doesn't look as good as the Camaro. Even then, it was very controversial for the time. But you want to know something? I think this car looks better than the fourth generation Camaro, especially where people say the Camaro looks like a catfish. But also, the front air intakes, even the rear with the taillights, this car just looks overall better. But how did GM manage to make the Trans Am stand out next to the Chevy Camaro, that it not only shared platforms with, but also body panels? Rather than going with a look that would have been more fitting for a car in the late 90s, the Trans Am took on a more retro appearance that resembled other sports coupes of the time period, with rounder front and rear ends and a complete lack of sharp bylines for the side profile. Unlike its cousin, the hideaway headlights added character to the styling, while at the same time critics were complaining about the design aspects, as it strayed too far away from the Camaro's less controversial road presence. On the flip side, the Trans Am got aggressive aesthetics, such as nostril grills and lights found on the front bumper, compared to a mere hood scoop on the Camaro. Despite the remaining cosmetic features of the 20th century, the design team certainly had the future in mind, or at the very least, what they thought the 21st century would usher in. And that becomes apparent as you glance at the rear fascia, with the less than subtle rear spoiler that swoops around the trunk lid, integrating almost perfectly into the seat pillar and rear window. Also, what can't be forgotten is the large taillights that make up a significant portion of the rear end styling, with the unique honeycomb pattern that fits the cosmetic features of Pontiacs at that time. Compare all of this to the Camaro, and while in 2000 it may have received higher praise, 20 years later, the Trans Am is one of the most distinct cars of its era. If you don't spend too much time staring at the side profile and noticing the same panels found on its cousin, you can appreciate just how different the Trans Am was outwardly, and how the Camaro's less conspicuous road presence still looks good today, but not as verbose as Pontiac, who up until their demise had a keen focus on continuing on a muscle car legacy, unlike Chevy, which continued on during the 7 years after the Camaro was discontinued in 2002. When looking at the price evaluations and how they have both appreciated in value, buyers are beginning to understand they weren't just the typical American muscle cars of the 90s, but in fact became baby Corvettes that not only gave you iconic looks, but components and mechanical aspects that many took for granted. Now, getting into the interior for the Pontiac Trans Am, there's only a few things that I want to highlight. Obviously, there's a very simplistic interior, with this being a 2000 model, but also there's no technology that's going to be drawing your attention away from the driving experience. So for the dashboard layout, you have physical buttons and dials for your radio presets. Also, you have a CD player and also dials for your climate control settings. Then beneath that, you'll have your traction control on and off switch, which I've kept on because obviously this isn't my car. Then, of course, you have analog gauges, which is a nice throwback to what cars used to be, because today, in 2021, you're going to have digital gauges in one way or another, whether it's an information display or it's just a full display. So it's really great to see that old school 20th century layout. But also these seats are really the highlight, in my opinion, because they do sit really nicely. So even though you are sitting closer to the ground and you feel planted, you have a good amount of vision in front of you. The seating position, I didn't need to adjust it that much, which I was a bit concerned of since I am a smaller person, I'm around 5'5", so I was kind of concerned when it came to that. But when it comes to the bolstering of these seats, they're really nice. They keep you in place for sure. But also, one thing that you don't see anymore is that near your thighs, they widen out as well, and there's some bolstering there. So you feel fully secure in this car, despite the fact that it is an F-body, which we all know is notoriously might be unsafe, but it's a great driver's car. It's a great atmosphere to be in, where I am not focusing on anything in the interior. I'm just focusing on the road ahead of me. There's no head-up display. There's nothing. You don't even have blind spot detection. This is just what driving used to be, and I still think should be, although the way some people drive on the roads today, they might need that technology. The ultimate feature to me, and this is why I think you have to be very careful with what Pontiac Trans Am or Chevrolet Camaro you go with, is the T-tops. You gotta go with the T-tops. It adds so much character to this car, whether it brings in some extra air above you, or it really, actually, in my opinion, I think it helps make this car sound better too, because you're hearing the exhaust, but also the engine in front of you. It adds such a atmosphere and environment that no car today is going to offer. Now, also, you will have second row seats, which to me are going to be useless outside of using for extra storage. So today I have all my camera gear back there because with the T-tops in the trunk, that will take away from the cargo space. And then for the rear cargo area, you will have some placements for your T-tops, and there is enough room back here for some smaller items. Now, obviously, with this being a 20-year-old car, and you're not buying this for its practicality, most likely you're not going to be putting any groceries or luggage back here. Maybe you are, maybe you aren't, but what I would suggest is that when you do have your T-tops back here, just use the second row seats as the extra cargo area. So in closing, what are my final thoughts of the Pontiac Trans Am WS6? Is it still a special car in my eyes? Is it one that I would still drive and own? And was it worth the 20 years of waiting? Because sometimes it's not good to meet your childhood heroes. Sometimes they let you down. And what I will say is, this car sounds fantastic. The V8, and when you get into right around 40 miles an hour, the engine opens up, and you just really hear that roar. And not a lot of cars have that anymore at all. However, and there's a big but, and that is the transmission. You gotta go with the 6-speed manual. You can't go with the 4-speed automatic. At least I can't. I can't do it after driving this car around for about 4.5 to 5 hours. And the reason why I say it is because you can't rev match, you can't downshift, and you kind of lose that. You lose that feeling. This car feels raw. It has a very raw feeling, but the automatic kind of makes it more sedated. Now, it makes it a great daily driver in the summertime. Love to drive that way, like in the traffic, like today. I don't have to worry about having my leg spasm up on me and have to keep my foot in the clutch. But I think I'd have to go 6-speed manual. Even though I am not someone who likes driving manual transmission cars, I prefer my automatics with my paddle shifters. With the paddle shifters though, you can manually downshift, you can manually upshift. And since there's no paddle shifters for this Trans Am, you don't have that ability. So when it comes to the accelerations, yes, you had that great sounding V8 and the Borla exhaust in this particular model, but you don't have the throwback to the gears. However, when it comes to the driving dynamics and handling, it is fantastic. The steering input is so nice and direct. And it's not something you expect from American cars, because you always hear, oh, the steering isn't that good, the suspension isn't that good, there's a lack of refinement, doesn't really feel high quality, especially F-body cars. No. After 5 hours, I'm feeling really happy with this car. I'm totally comfortable with it. And also the plastics don't bother me at all. I'm truly enjoying my driving experience. Also, when it comes to the looks of the car, still an all-time classic in my eyes. The front fascia to me just stands out so much. I love the nostril grille and air intakes. Also, of course, you can't forget the pop-up lights. Just to let you know, this car is from the turn of the century. And then also, just the overall simplicity. It's raw. Also the interior, it's just physical dials and analog gauges, and I love that. This car still is special. Also T-tops. It's the perfect summer car to me. It would be the perfect weekend car if I wanted to get something next to the GTI in my driveway. That is for sure. So would I drive a Pontiac Trans Am? Would I buy one? I think I would after today. It has definitely touched my soul in more ways than one. But like I said before, gotta go with the manual. So guys, thank you so much for watching this video. Please like, comment, share, and subscribe for more. Also make sure to follow me on Instagram at Boston Autoblog so you can see what I'm up to and what vehicles I'll be featuring in the future. And I will see you guys next time.